Okay, so the scatter diagram in figure 9.2. Okay, so the scatter diagram shows birth rates per thousand and physicians per thousand for all countries in the pre-release dataset. Describe the correlation in the scatter diagram. Well, it's definitely negative correlation, but that is not a description. That is just what type of correlation it is. So to describe it, what impact does it have on these two variables, the birth rate, and what does it have in comparison to the physicians? So specifically, what impact does it have on the birth rates? So we want to make sure that we include the two variables that are used. We want to include the two variables that the scatter diagram refers to in our interpretation or description of the correlation. So the birth rates of all the countries in Australasia are shown below. So the three countries, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea. Explain why the calculation below is not a correct method to find the birth rate per thousand for Australasia as a whole. Okay, this calculation actually assumes that the population in each of these countries would be the same. If that was a fact, then we could do the calculation as said, but some countries actually have a much bigger population than others. Australia has a huge population in comparison to New Zealand or Papua New Guinea. So we do need to take into account the size of population from which this calculation came from. It's similar to having two groups of students. 48 students sat a test on Monday and scored 100%. 2 students sat a test on Tuesday and scored 50%. So the teacher thinks the average score for the class is 75. 150, average of those two scores, 75. That would not be correct. To find the average, we would have to do 100 times 48 for the students who sat it on Monday, and 50 times 2 for the students who sat it on Tuesday. Put those all together and divide that by 50. Now that's going to give us the actual average, which will be a lot closer to 100. It is a lot more representative than the other calculation or non-calculation. Similar things happening here. If we don't take into account the population size of each of these countries, we have not actually found the average birth rate for Australasia as a whole. Okay, so the calculation I described is a weighted mean calculation. So either of these two should be sufficient to get you the mark. Just go the extra mile and mention both of these would be my recommendation. All right, so with that in mind, so if we did actually recalculate the birth rate for Australasia, would it be above or below 16.83? Well, looking here, Australia actually has the lowest of the birth rates, and Australia has the largest population, so it should contribute more towards the final answer. So that smaller number should be more represented in the final mean, which we should interpret to mean that the mean would actually be lower than the 16.83. Okay, so yeah, Australia should have a larger weighting in the calculation. So just like the example I gave before, those 48 students who sat the exam on Monday, they're going to contribute a lot more towards the average than those 2 who sat it on the Tuesday. So their weighting is larger. The mean is going to move more towards their individual grouped mean was. Okay, moving on. So the scatter diagram so the scatter diagram shown below shows the birth rate per thousand and physicians per thousand population for all the countries in the pre-release data sets. Describe the correlation in the scatter diagram. Okay, so we can see that it's going to be a negative correlation, but what we really want is to be a bit more specific and to involve the variables that were given to us in the first place. All right, so it's birth rate per thousand and physicians per thousand. Okay, so weak negative correlation. As the physicians per thousand increases, the birth rate per thousand reduces. Just to be on the safe side, I've said what type of correlation it is, so I've stated, and I've gone ahead and used the variables, so I've added some context to my understanding of the correlation. Okay, so we're asked to discuss briefly whether the scatter diagram shows the higher birth rates would be reduced by increasing the number of physicians in a country. We've got to be careful here of misleading data. Yes, there seems to be correlation. It's very weak, but there does seem to be some correlation. But just because we see that there's correlation doesn't mean that there's causality. It doesn't mean that there's a direct association. It doesn't mean that increasing the physicians is going to reduce the birth rates. They just tend to have this sort of relationship, but that might be connected to a third factor that we're not aware of. So it is sometimes dangerous, and we should take caution before saying that an increase in this thing should lead directly to an increase in another.